He was 19 and had passed the preliminary law examination when he fell outrageously in love with one of his piano students. A bored and sentimental married woman who must have found the frantic, temperamental, provocative, and outspoken artist very attractive, notwithstanding his diminutive stature, his shock of curly black hair, the large nose set in a huge head, the tiny hands and feet, and a nervous and mobile face. After all, the 18th century novel of sentiment was still current, and much of the world seemed souffrant de l'amour. For his part, Hoffmann worshipped her as Cora, the virgin heroine in a contemporary second-rate play who commits the ultimate sacrifice for love. But having reached heaven, there was nowhere else to go. The relationship was finally and fortunately terminated. Hoffmann, in a frenzy of compensating creativity, finished a novel, Cornaro, which was never published, and then another, Der Geheimnisvoll, the Mysterious Man, of which only a fragment remains. After his mother's death and his tragic affair with Cora, Hoffmann, then 21, left Königsberg for the Silesian town of Glogau, where he was intent upon preparing for the law examinations required by the Prussian civil service. Here he lived with another uncle, became engaged to his cousin. The engagement was to last for 4 dutiful years, but was never to terminate in marriage. Completed an opera and joined in a local dramatic society. 2 years after his arrival in Glogau, the family moved to Berlin, and there Hoffmann passed his final examination with honors. Instead of the desired post in Berlin, however, he was required to begin a probationary period in Posen, an administrative center in Prussian Poland. Away from his family for the first time and justifiably bitter at a harsh fate and an unreceptive world, Hoffmann engaged in what was once called dissolute pleasures. He drank and winched himself into exhaustion. Further, in an atmosphere where the civil and military officials seemed to be forever engaged in those ugly little quarrels, he did less than endear himself to the various bigwigs by drawing savage caricatures of them, which his friends so diligently distributed that they fell into the hands of the governor himself. These capers were expensive. They cost Hoffmann his assignment in Posen. Instead, in 1802, he was sent to Plock, a town of almost Gogolian dreariness. Here, at least partly in desperation, he married a Polish woman who, aside from perseverance and faithfulness, no mean feats, seems to have had as her major talent the ability to speak Polish. The Hoffmanns were to remain in Plock for 2 years, during which time Hoffmann saw his first work published, an essay on the use of the classical chorus in drama. He also wrote a comedy, Der Preis, the Prize, several operetta texts, a mass for one of the local convents, and a sonata. Hoffmann had therefore managed to begin living 2 lives, that of the official and that of the artist. But he apparently accomplished this at major cost to his health, for he began to drink more heavily than before, and as he recorded in his diary, began to suffer from anxieties about doubles and from fears and premonitions of death. The concept of doubles apparently haunted Hoffmann long before he used it in fiction. While in Plock, he wrote an entry in his diary describing his awareness of a divided self. And in 1809, he wrote in his diary that, "I imagine that I see myself through a multiplying glass. All the forms which move around me are myselfs." At this critical time, Hippel came to the rescue and managed to have Hoffmann transferred to Warsaw, a bustling and vivacious city in which theater and opera and all the arts flourished. Here, Hoffmann at last found the peace and the friendship necessary to devote himself seriously to art. The friends were Eduard Hitzig and Zacharias Werner. Hitzig, only recently transferred from Berlin, had studied under A.W. Schlegel and knew a good deal about the new Romantic movement. Crucially, it was he who introduced Hoffmann to Brentano, Tieck, and Novalis. Werner, poet, dramatist, mystic, who had as a boy been Hoffmann's neighbor in Königsberg, further encouraged and stimulated Hoffmann's creative impulses. Hoffmann thrived. His official duties were hardly onerous, and he was appointed musical director of a newly formed orchestra sponsored by the Warsaw Academy of Music. Not only did he supervise the reconstruction of the ancient building used by the Academy following his own architectural plans, but Hoffmann painted a series of murals for the building as well. Indeed, the enormously energetic Hoffmann seems to have been engaged in a host of only vaguely connected activities. There is no question but that he thought he was successful both as musical director and as legal official, though, to be sure, legal business was often conducted at the Academy, sometimes with Hoffmann flat on his back on a scaffold, painting and singing. And the business of the Academy was sometimes conducted under strangely official circumstances. Hoffmann had somehow learned to live in his two different worlds. At any rate, more important than the financial success of the Academy was Hoffmann's creative activity. At this time, he composed what some critics believe to be the first truly romantic music. Incidental pieces to Werner's play Das Kreuz and der Ostsee, The Cross by the Baltic Sea. This unwontedly pleasant and rewarding interlude was rudely disrupted in 1806 when Napoleon, having defeated the Prussians, replaced their officials with Frenchmen. Hoffmann tried valiantly to scratch out a living as a professional musician. He wrote his first symphony, several sonatas, and many pieces of chamber music. But it was an impossible situation, and already suffering from poverty and a nervous collapse, he was forced to send his wife and infant daughter to relatives in Posen. Embittered, but never for a moment without principle, Hoffmann refused to take a pledge of allegiance demanded of all Prussian officials by the French, and he departed for Berlin, his wife and daughter remaining behind in Posen. Hoffmann would literally have died of starvation in Berlin if faithful Hippel had not again intervened, this time supplying the very necessities of life. Hoffmann, as always, was astoundingly industrious, working at musical odd jobs, painting stage sets, nailing props, and so on, but money was almost impossible to come by. When news arrived that his daughter had died of cholera and that his wife was seriously ill, Hoffmann's fate seemed blacker than ever. He was tormented by paranoia and convinced that his ultimate destruction was imminent, but his wife recovered and joined him. And in the spring of 1808, Hoffmann was offered a position as theater musical director in Bamberg. He gratefully accepted. Typically, what was begun so enthusiastically was to lead to a string of minor disasters. Bamberg itself proved wonderfully pleasant and colorful, but the orchestra was torn by politics. After 2 enervating months, Hoffmann submitted his resignation as the conductor, but agreed to remain behind at a reduced salary to compose incidental music and ballets. He supplemented his small income by giving music lessons and doing portraits. He did, however, have the considerable satisfaction of assisting or directing several productions which were notable for their artistic innovation. He also played a major role in staging Shakespeare and Calderon. Although the theatrical venture faltered in 1809, it was resumed the following year. Hoffmann now became engaged in a variety of capacities and for the first time in his life achieved an income which at least provided a modicum of security. He launched his career as a music critic and wrote what many consider to be impressionistic, perceptive, and surprisingly modern criticism. And he began his literary career in earnest. He also managed to fall in love with a 16-year-old piano student. This heavenly relationship, unlike his affair with Cora, was decidedly one-sided. Not only was Hoffmann's love not reciprocated, but the girl seems never to have been aware that it even existed. Hoffmann, now 36 and the best drinker in town, had a complexion that already bespoke a decaying liver and a weakening constitution. His one-sided and frustrating love for the young and lovely girl drove him to extravagant fits of self-pity and depression. The specter of death, which had haunted him since his days in Plock, returned in earnest to obsess him. In 1812, the theater failed again, and Hoffmann was once more reduced to groveling for his bread. His diary entry of 26 November contains the terse comment that he had, quote, sold his coat so that he could eat, end of quote. But in April of the following year, Hoffmann, now supported by a small legacy from his uncle, left Bamberg forever and started out for Dresden, where a job as musical director in the theater awaited him, and where he would also manage to conduct his operatic group. The strange destiny which always pursued him saw to it, however, that the Napoleonic Wars broke out again at this time, so that Hoffmann, who so badly needed a stable position, found himself forced to alternate between Dresden and Leipzig for almost 2 years, his schedule depending primarily on the specific location of troops at any given time. The battles were so much part of the situation that Hoffmann even managed to be wounded, for frequently he would perversely insist upon observing the fighting from very close range.